This episode is brought to you by HASA. Liquid is clearly better. Liquid chlorine is the highest purity, works immediately, has no added cyanuric acid or calcium, and it will leave your pool safe, clean, and clear. And by the bottom feeder professional grade battery powered vacuum system. It sucks to clean pools, so cleaning pools sucks less. Get $100 off with code DVB100.
This episode is brought to you by Skimmer, the #1 pool service software in North America. With Skimmer, you can streamline your schedule, grow your revenue, and keep your customers coming back with 5-star service. Whether you're a one-person operation or an established team, Skimmer is your partner in success. Visit getskimmer.com/poolguy to try Skimmer for free for 30 days.
The Pool Guy Podcast Show. The Pool Guy Podcast Show. The Pool Guy Podcast Show.
Hi, welcome to the Pool Guy Podcast Show. In this episode, I'm going to continue my talk about 3-inch Triclor tablets, and I'll go over some ways to effectively use them in the pool and to kind of mitigate some of the downside of the Triclor tablet, which is that overuse of the tablets will raise the cyanuric acid level in the pool to really high levels. So I'll go over ways to use them effectively without that happening. Are you a pool service pro looking to take your business to the next level? Join the Pool Guy coaching program. Get expert advice, business tips, exclusive content, and get direct support from me. I'm a 35-year veteran in the industry. Whether you're starting out or scaling up, I've got the tools to help you succeed. Learn more at swimmingpoollearning.com. And I'll start again with the caution with using Triclor tablets in a vinyl and fiberglass pool. I would not use them in this pool surface type. In fact, a lot of fiberglass pool resurfacing companies will void the warranty of their reglazing if you use Triclor tablets because they know that it's going to lower the pH in that fiberglass pool dramatically or the vinyl pool, and it also can stain the pool really easily. So again, you don't want to use a Triclor tablet in that pool surface type. They're perfectly safe for plaster. They're basically, plaster is basically cement, and Pebble Tech, which is basically river rock. The only time you're going to have a problem with the tablets in those pools, again, I mentioned the step area. If you have the floater over the step, a lot of that Triclor will kind of bleed out into the step and stain it or cause it to be discolored. And the same with a tablet falling onto the bottom of the pool. Other than that, they're really safe to use in a floater and in a Triclor offliner on inline chlorinator as well. Now, how can you use tablets effectively? If you listen to the last podcast, which I recommend you do, I talk about Triclor tablets and the good benefits and the downside if you use too many of them. And they can be overused really easily because it's kind of like candy. Like once you start using it, you just use it because it's easy. I guess candy is not a good analogy, but it's one of those things where they're the #1 form of chlorine out there for sure. They outsell all the other chlorine types because of the ease of use. So in that respect, I think that's why they get overused sometimes, is that the ease of use is so easy. You just put 2 or 3 of them in a floater or the inline chlorinator and just forget about your pool for a week and you're fine. The problem is you're adding a lot of cyanuric acid. About half of the tablet is cyanuric acid, so you don't want to overuse them for that reason because, as I mentioned in the other podcast, with the cyanuric acid, the more cyanuric acid you have, the higher and higher the free chlorine level needs to be in the pool for it to be effective. Now, how can you use Triclor tablets effectively and not have the high cyanuric acid problem or not have to drain the pool? Well, it's really simple, and I talk about this and I preach this to my group about using a combination approach to a chlorine pool. Now, one of the great things about liquid chlorine and cal hypo, they do have a byproduct as well. So I'll just go over that briefly. Cyanuric acid is being added to the pool through the Triclor tablets. About 50% of the tablet is cyanuric acid. So if you use 20 pounds of tablets during the season, you're adding 10 pounds of cyanuric acid to the water. If you're using cal hypo, you're adding some calcium. And if you're using liquid chlorine, you're adding salt to the pool. So what is the best way to, and by the way, I didn't mention dichlor because dichlor has cyanuric acid and it wouldn't work in this scenario. So basically, it's like with anything, too much of something cannot be good at some point. So if you're, eating a lot of steak or burgers is probably not good for your heart. The cholesterol level builds up. But if you don't eat any kind of protein, then you start getting anemia. So you really can't do too much or too little of something, and it's got to be a balance. And this is the balanced approach to sanitizing a pool using Triclor tablets. And this is the way I do it, and this is the way I recommend that you do it also out on your pool route and with your backyard pool. Use the Triclor tablets in conjunction with an unstabilized chlorine, which in this case would be either liquid chlorine or cal hypo. What I mean by that is neither of those have any cyanuric acid in them. So you kind of see where I'm going here. It's kind of like a balanced diet for your pool, just like you need a balanced diet for you to be healthy. And one of the parts of the balanced diet for the pool is not overusing one chlorine type. And this is something that you have to also keep in mind is a lot of people say, well, I'm not going to use Triclor tablets at all. I'm just going to use liquid chlorine. That's fine. That's not a problem. There's no problem with that, except for the fact that liquid chlorine has no stabilizer. So if you have, let's say, cyanuric acid in the pool and you're at 50 parts per million, and you want to just use liquid chlorine to maintain that pool, you may be adding that liquid chlorine every day or every other day to the pool. And it's one of those things where it can become not cost effective and a hassle because you really don't have any stabilized chlorine being released into the pool on a regular basis to keep that free chlorine level up during the week, especially if you're in the middle of summer, you have a larger pool and you have a high UV index. You really do need some stabilized chlorine, in my opinion, to make the job easier. So what would be a good formula for a pool using Triclor and another form of chlorine? Well, it's pretty basic. You would use the tablet to kind of give you a base chlorine during the week. And then while you're at the pool, you would add chlorine to the pool to bring the chlorine level up. And this is a pretty effective way to manage the pools out there. Sometimes you're going to need more tablets if it's like a really hot week and the UV index is really high and less of the liquid chlorine and cal hypo. Sometimes you're going to need more liquid chlorine and cal hypo and less of the tablets. Now, one thing in the equation of this balanced diet that really helps, and I guess if I'm talking about the food analogy, it'd be like taking the Ozempic, the weight loss drug, along with the balanced diet. And this is actually a pretty good analogy because you can use what I call a chlorine enhancer. I don't think I came up with the term, but I use it a lot in my podcast. I use it a lot out there. These are products that make the chlorine last longer in the pool by making them more effective. In other words, these products will take care of things that use up the chlorine, like fighting algae or other things in the pool, phosphated enzymes. You have PoolRx Plus, you have the borates you can add to the pool. Now, the reason why I like using these products is that they, again, extend the life of the chlorine. They kind of enhance the chlorine's ability to last longer in the pool, basically, because they're not being used up fighting microalgae or algae in the pool, or the gunk that happens when people are swimming in the pool is something that is highly effective. And this will allow you to use less chlorine in the pool, which in turn allows you to use less Triclor tablets, which in turn allows you not to add as much cyanuric acid to the pool. And you can use another chlorine type of liquid chlorine and cal hypo in conjunction with this. And this is a highly effective formula, and it's something that very successful pool companies use out there. So if you're just putting 3 or 4 tablets in a floater and calling it a day, you're not using any of these enhancers, PoolRx Plus, borates, a phosphate and enzyme combination. Now, you don't have to use all 3 of these in the pool. One of these will suffice. One season I was testing out phosphate and enzymes, and I used that pretty exclusively on my pool route, and I found them to be highly effective. That's why when the manager at Leslie's hands someone a bottle of, their Perfect Weekly, they know it's going to be effective because it contains phosphates and enzyme. Phosphate removers doesn't contain phosphates. That would be opposite, but it does have a phosphate remover and an enzyme in there, and that helps control the phosphate level, which is one food source for algae, thereby freeing up the chlorine to be more effective. PoolRx Plus does the same thing. It has an EPA-registered algicide, has copper, zinc, and silver in it, and this will prevent algae from growing in the pool. By you not having algae in the pool, the chlorine is freed up to work more effectively, which means it's going to last longer, and you're going to need less chlorine in the pool with a PoolRx Plus unit in the pool. And then borates is an algistat, and this will, of course, cause algae not even to form at a molecular level. It does something to the cells and they can't develop, and the algae won't even grow in the pool. So all of these working together, one is all you're going to need usually, but you can do borates and Polar X. You can do enzyme phosphates and Polar X. Not going to harm anything. You just don't really need all three combined if you don't want to spend the money for all three combined. And it's going to allow the chlorine to be much more effective in the pool using one of these enhancers. And then you have the balanced diet where you have maybe instead of using 3 Triclor tablets, you're using 1 Triclor tablet. And then if you need to raise the chlorine from 3 parts per million to 5 or 8 parts per million, you just add liquid chlorine and cal hypo to the pool. Any of those non-stabilized chlorine types will be really helpful in allowing you not to use too many of the Triclor tablets on a weekly basis in your service accounts or in your own backyard pool. I'm often asked also, well, when would you partially drain a pool? How high of the cyanuric acid level does it need to be at for you to drain a pool partially? My baseline is probably a little higher than most people's baseline, but I just go off of basically what I've found out there to be effective. Once it gets to 100 parts per million, you really want to consider a partial drain of the pool, maybe draining a foot of water to drop it back down to 80 parts per million, because I found that anything over 100 parts per million makes it much harder to maintain the pool. Now, I did give the formula in the last podcast, and I'll give it here as well. A good baseline calculation, if you have too much cyanuric acid, basically is how much free chlorine you want to add to your pool each week would be a reason not to have the cyanuric acid get too high. For example, Bob Lowry says that your free chlorine level should be 7.5% of your cyanuric acid level. If you're using one of these enhancers I mentioned, you would only need 5% in this formula, and I'll give you that calculation as well. But let's just say your cyanuric acid level is 150 parts per million. If you times that by 7.5%, that means that you're going to have a little over 11 parts per million of free chlorine in the pool each day on a daily basis to prevent algae from forming, to prevent the pool from getting cloudy, so that the chlorine is effective. Now, of course, if you're using an enhancer and your cyanuric acid level is at 150 parts per million, 5% of that is going to be less. That's 7.5 parts per million. So about 8 parts per million, which is not terrible, but why would you want to be adding all that chlorine to the pool? You're wasting product, you're wasting money basically by adding so much chlorine to the pool to make it effective with the high cyanuric acid level. So I would say my point would be at 100 parts per million, I would do a partial drain of the pool to bring it down, because at 100 parts per million, at 7.5%, you have to add about 8 parts per million, or keep the chlorine, I should say, at 8 parts per million. And if you're using an enhancer, you have to keep it at 5 parts per million, which is not terrible, and that's why 100 parts per million is my baseline. I generally like to keep the pools on my route at about 80 parts per million. I have some saltwater pools, and 80 parts per million is pretty good. But even for a chlorine pool, 80 parts per million is still fair because I keep a higher free chlorine level on the pools on my route, and I do use enhancers. So 5% of 80, you're looking at 4 parts per million. And I do keep my pools anywhere from 5 to 8 parts per million in the summertime, just to have a little bit of built-in insurance out there that I'm not going to have algae or problems if someone were to go swimming or have a party. It's going to hold up pretty well. But the winning formula really is not to overuse the Triclor tablets and just be adding more and more, tablets to the pool. It's going to be exponentially more and more tablets if you just use that. So if you start off the season in May using 2 tablets, by the time you get to August, you're probably going to use about 4 or 5 tablets to have the same effect or to keep the same free chlorine level, because the cyanuric acid level has built up to a pretty high amount if you're just using purely Triclor tablets in the pool and nothing else during the season. And you can actually manage a pool this way. There's really nothing inherently wrong with this except the fact that you're wasting product and the chlorine is not going to be highly effective. A lot of people do it. It's something that's done all the time. I'm not arguing against using Triclor tablets exclusively. I'm just saying that there's a better way to do it. If you just want to just load up the floater with tablets every week, and then by the end of summer, you're using a lot more tablets than at the beginning of summer, that's how you want to operate. You can do that. But the problem is, if the pool develops a problem, it's much harder to turn that pool around and cure it. And you're going to need a boatload of chlorine to turn that pool around in a lot of cases. That's why a lot of people that maintain their own pool give up. They're struggling. I took over this pool one time. I think I mentioned this before. I got back there and there's just these buckets of chlorine, cases of liquid chlorine that have been used, and 3 buckets of 3-inch Triclor tablets that were back there. And they had one of those large floaters they were loading up with tablets. I'm not sure what the cyanuric acid level was, but I'm thinking it was over 300 parts per million. And so once they started developing algae, they just were in this endless cycle because the pool was just completely saturated with cyanuric acid, and there was just no way to put enough chlorine in there to break it and get that pool in shape. So you don't want to actually be in that position, and that's why I think this is the best way you can maintain a pool if you have a chlorine pool. It's not to overuse the tablets, not to underuse them either, because then you're spending a lot more money with liquid chlorine and cal hypo. It's kind of a balance, and you'll have to figure this out with your pool. With the enhancer, let's say you're using a Pooler X Plus unit, you're going to already subtract 50% of the chlorine you're using. So if you're using 3 tablets, you'll go down to 1.5 tablets. And if you really wanted to go down to 1 tablet and then maybe add some liquid chlorine to the pool midweek, or if you service that pool, add half a gallon of liquid chlorine to that pool, that's perfectly fine. And you're going to keep a really balanced pool. And there may not be any need to drain the water in that pool. So at the end of the season, maybe the cyanuric acid level is a little higher than 100, maybe it's at 140. I would say that if you get a fair amount of rain or a decent amount of rain, that will dilute it. Plus, cyanuric acid does break down on its own naturally over time. I believe that's the case a lot of times when you see pools that have a high cyanuric acid level in areas where you don't get a lot of rain, and cyanuric acid drops in the pool. So it's going to, of course, when you backwash the filter and clean it, you're going to lose some water. Plus, refilling the pool is also going to dilute it slightly, even though it doesn't evaporate out of there. And so you don't have to drain the pool usually if you follow this formula and you're not adding a ton of cyanuric acid to the pool. If you're using a 50-pound bucket during the season, that means you're adding 25 pounds of cyanuric acid to the pool. And in a 15,000-gallon pool, that's a huge amount of cyanuric acid to that pool. The bigger the pool, the less effects the cyanuric acid and the tablets have on it, because there's more water distributed there. But the smaller the pool, the much higher the cyanuric acid will accumulate and make it harder to maintain that pool. So try this method. I think you're going to find great success in it, using tablets not as your primary sanitizer, but as a as a partner with the other sanitizers in the pool, the liquid chlorine or the cal hypo. And of course, don't forget the chlorine enhancer. I think there's something that should be used in every pool, and you just pick the one you like the best. A lot of people like the phosphated enzymes. I'm not opposed to that. Some people like the Pooler X Plus unit. I like those as well. Others just like adding borates to 50 parts per million. I like that as well. I'm not opposed to it. And I think it's something that you should do automatically at the beginning of the season, just so that the chlorine lasts longer. And the cost of these products is going to be, you're going to get a built-in return on your investment because you're going to use less chlorine, which means you're spending less money on chlorine. And you'll find that it's going to make your pool care much easier using these enhancers. If you're looking for other podcasts, you can find those on my website. Click on the podcast icon. You'll get a menu of 1,600 podcasts there. And if you're interested in the coaching program that I offer, you can learn more at poolguycoaching.com. Thanks for listening to this podcast. Have a great rest of your week, and God bless. This episode is brought to you by HASA, providing products that deliver clean, healthy water for every aspect of everyday life. The bottom feeder battery-powered vacuum system, portable, powerful, and only weighs 12 pounds. And Skimmer. Get Skimmer, America's #1 pool service software. Podcast listeners can try Skimmer for free at getskimmer.com/poolguy.